This is the second lecture about robotic arm manipulator control, and it's about timing, and I will explain later what coordination means. It's connected. So first remind you that in vehicle motion planning, we were talking about paths that were generated by behavioral dynamics. So there was dynamics there, time course stuff already there, through the fact that the path might depend on current sensory information, because when the vehicle moves, it might acquire new sensory information, and therefore that changes the plan or the path and so on. So in that sense, it's a time-dependent system, dynamical system. We use two approaches that are explicitly dynamical systems approaches. Other approaches to this in other ways, algorithmically. And so you might think, well, there's already timing in there, but there was certainly not that constraint that you arrive at a particular point in time, at a particular point in space at a particular time. So for instance, if you're held up by an obstacle, well, then you will just arrive later, right? So the speed was an independent controlled variable. That's a very common assumption for vehicle motion, and we'll see a nuance in that later. In robotic arm movements, it's classically, we're also thinking about path as path planning. Some of the methods, as you saw when you read that review chapter, are the same. They're just in configuration space. And then time is a parameter, the parameter how you run through the path. And that's then analogous to vehicles, except that in most robotic arm movements, we're not actually thinking of that time plan being updated, because presumably when you plan the path of the hand, you have the entire information about the environment, where the objects are, and so on. So it's all fixed. We'll see in a moment that's not maybe true for autonomous arms, and then we'll get back to dynamics. And I'll make this problematic, though, in a moment. I'll talk about timing in a more ambitious sense, and you will. That's relevant for autonomous robotics. So here's a little bit a guideline through what I will be talking about. I will be first talking about timing in classical robots. That's really this parameterization textbook stuff. And I just do this to make it, to contrast that with what is required in autonomous robotics. I will give you a short survey over approaches to timing in autonomous robots, and not explain it in detail, just to make the problem clear. And then I'll actually expand on how human movement is timed. And that's when it will really become clear what actually timing is supposed to be. It's a quite ambiguous term in English. There's no good German term for that. And I'll make that much clearer, define different aspects of it, define the solutions that were developed in that domain that have to do with dynamic systems. Again, it's actually part of my past research work. And then from that perspective, you will be able to appreciate better what I had meant here earlier when I briefly reviewed these robotic examples. And I'll come back to that then, and in the final chapter, we'll show you a little bit more technically how timing problems are solved in autonomous reaching, catching, things like that. It's quite an interesting chapter, sort of at the core of the difficulty of autonomous robotics, of dealing with environments that are changing, and in which you might be interacting without precise information about the environment. Good. So let's start with a simple thing: timing in conventional robotics. One of the textbooks that I mentioned, the easier one, not the very mathematical one, actually does have a chapter, and I took some pictures from that textbook, the Lynch and Park textbook, that reviews that a little bit. And so, as I already mentioned, in the classical conception, you can separate space and time. That is, you can plan a path through configuration space, and it's just a question of how you parameterize that in time, and then you can actually run it faster or slower. You can rescale time. So time is independent. When you can rescale everything in time, that means they're independent. You can choose them. And it's the task of the control system to make sure that you can track that desired time course then. Because that's the limit, right? You cannot rescale it to a level where the controller cannot do that very well. But as I argued last week, typically control is very, very good. And that's one of the strengths of classical robotics, that you can pretty much have like an order of magnitude of rescaling that's possible. That's why some of these industry arms can work so fast. And when you design them, program them, actually often people will do that first, that the robot moves slowly to make sure everything's fine, and then they just up the knot and run through it faster. So the way that's concretely done varies. There are approaches to path planning that are in joint space or in end effector space. That's been a long topic in discussion in human movement by inspiration from robotics, whether humans plan more in one space and the others. Sometimes a little bit odd, that discussion. In robotics, typically we're looking at non-redundant systems. So there's a one-to-one relationship between a joint trajectory and an end effector trajectory, right, which is invertible. And so it's really more a question of how parametrically these paths are defined. You can see if you plan in and typical approaches would use straight lines as paths when there's no obstruction in the space in which you represent the movement. So for instance, if you do it in joint space, a straight line in joint space amounts to a curved space in end effector space with sine and cosine function that some of you figured out in the last exercise. Conversely, if you were to plan in end effector space, then you would get a curved trajectory in joint space, right? This is a straight path in end effector space, and that leads to a curved trajectory in joint space. And it was that signature actually that people were looking for in human behavior, and were finding that human behavior does tend to have relatively straight hand paths in space. And so the notion was that actually human movement is planned, and again, a bit vague what it actually means, planned in end effector space rather than joint space. And of course, in humans, the joints are not the units, it's the muscles, and so it's not different. This can be generalized as we discussed briefly when we talked about path planning. You can do it configuration space, which means you expand it to 3D plus the rotational degree of freedom, where you have this complication of how to represent that, right? And I'm not formally defining that. These would be the so-called screw paths that capture both position and orientation. Good. So when you have that, you have a path, right? And the path is typically described by a path parameter that tells you where you are in the path. It's depending on the mathematical approach you do. And you can replace that by time, by some scaled function of time, or some function that monotonic function of time is that path parameter, so that you do advance in the path, you don't go back, but you can vary the speed with which you go forward. And this is done in classical planning just by using simple polynomials in time. And you can determine the parameters of these polynomials to be right, so that you get from the starting point to the end point in a defined time. You essentially have to find the zeros of this. And in most cases, one is actually going to a fifth order description, because what the constraints are not just that you have an initial point, starting point in a given time, but you also want to have zero velocity initially, zero velocity finally, and maybe even zero acceleration or very small acceleration initially and finally. So you have a smooth landing. And it depends on these constraints, whether you use 3 parameters or 5 parameters to get this right. And if you use the software packages that some of the robotic programmers have, then you can choose profiles like that. Alternatively, there are simpler profiles, for instance, velocity profiles like this that might be smooth a little bit here. There's a little smoothing, not have large accelerations. They sometimes make it easier to coordinate. And there's coordination in classical robotics that you need to know. Is the space free at that time, so I can do something else there, or I have better ways of organizing that, and that's easier with profiles like that, and for other reasons as well. There is some interesting optimization happening where people are looking at how fast they could move if they want to move maximally fast, and that takes essentially control constraints like the maximum acceleration, deceleration that you have into account. And it's sort of analogous to the dynamic window approach, where you compute a priori what will be the maximum accelerations that you have to take that as a constraint, and then limit the velocity curve to comply with these constraints. This is kind of a small optimization problem. So it's like a done deal. standard applied to robotics. You learn that when you are engineering that area. That's where we're coming from. Now, let's think about autonomous robotics. So in autonomous robotics, there are a couple of challenges when you want to apply this. So clearly, this is based on having a detailed model of the task, particularly of where the objects are, where the arm is initially, where the object is, in precise coordinates, soft landing, to a coordinate that you know a priori and that you know precisely. If it's a little bit off, then you're going to hit the object maybe or miss the object. It also makes the strong demands on the control system. That is, you have to really track the path well so that you get a soft landing, right? Because if you lag behind or you exceed your trajectory, then you might still hit it. And that's, you can imagine, these are not very good assumptions for autonomous robotics, in which we typically assume that we have perception about the objects, and perception can be wrong. So there might be an error in the first case, and that might be something that also, there might be perturbations to your arm. If you make your arm a little softer in control to accommodate humans and so on, you might not have that same level of precision. And therefore, you need something more robust. And by robust, I mean something that doesn't break when you insert error. And in the lecture about control, I actually talk to you about a fundamental problem in control, the lack of robustness of certain kind of control principles that says it's a fundamental challenge that can be only addressed by changing the planning part, not really. There's no secret trick in control how to go around that. And I want to highlight a few things just to give you a flavor of that have already solved some of those problems. And the theory for that is not perfect. And later we'll see what the more advanced theory is. So the very influential person in that field is someone called Koticek. I actually hesitated to have you read one of his papers, but then I decided it was a bit over the top. A research paper, a review paper, so the general paper we wrote recently about all these prompts. So he did one cool thing. It was there was a version that was a juggling robot. So this earliest one was just a robot that just had to keep a ball in the air with a paddle. And it was uniquely simple in a way. So to keep the paddle, to keep the ball in the, let's say, if you think about the vertical and the horizontal, right? The horizontal plane. To keep the ball in the horizontal plane, there was a simple control rule where the ball was observed, I think, by a camera. I don't remember. I think it was maybe a camera. It was very simple, like a ball that you could segment easily, a white on black background, something like that. And so we're able to look where the ball is horizontally, and then simply if it deviated from a desired region, it would change the incline of the paddle at impact. And to keep it vertically going, it did something like a resonance idea. So it actually moved the pedal periodically, and it made a model of the ball's trajectory. The ball was given an initial impulse, and the pedal essentially transmits an impulse. It will fly a certain amount of time. It depends on how much impulse it has. And energy is used up, goes down. It's a solvable equation, and they inserted that into the equation for the paddle to generate something like a periodic solution that would create periodic movement of the ball. So that is a model of the ball where the arm is just injecting momentum around that. And that worked. Now, that worked somewhat robustly. That is, you could perturb the ball, insert the ball at different moments in time. It would find its periodic solution. It's a periodic movement, right? This would be not like a reaching movement where you do it once and that's good. And all the examples I initially show are periodic, which is sort of simpler than a discrete motor act. But that was a paradigm. And a related piece of work, I actually don't know if Reibert, who has priority there. And so they're both very famous. Reibert's hopping machines, hopping robots. Anybody heard about these? One-leg hopping machines. He wrote a whole book about that. He was a professor at MIT. He's the founder of the Boston Dynamics company. which does the code. And if I'm lucky, I can show you a video of any of his current robots, I mean, of the team. I'm not sure how involved he is now in the company. And so that was analogous in the sense it was a device that had it wasn't a pedal. It was sort of the inverse. This robot had to stay in the plane, and it would stay in the plane. It was just jumping, eject its leg, extend its leg abruptly to give it upward momentum, and by controlling the angle of the leg, single leg, it could control any sideways problem. And to keep up in the air, it simply has again to model the motion of that object under free fall with the injection of the vector momentum it gets on impact to keep it going, right? To be in a periodic orbit. And that worked perfectly well. And that is at the core of all the, it means much elaborate, of all these walking machines that he has. You can see this already gives you some form of robustness because it doesn't actually have to have a precise injection point of that momentum. For instance, if the robot is hopping along and suddenly there's a step and therefore it will get the momentum earlier and maybe in a slightly different direction, that will just phase shift a little bit the oscillator. It will not do the exact cycle time, but it's a stable oscillator. I mean, it's designed to be a stable oscillator. So we'll go back to the rhythm, and as long as the lateral control works well enough, it will keep going, right? So this makes it unnecessary to have a precise model of the time to contact to when you hit the ground, where you hit the ground, and so on. That enables that to work autonomously. In some of these more modern versions, these like robots they use can do just that. They can walk over rough terrain because they're just doing their periodic motion. And if the cycle is shortened or lengthened, and there's a certain perturbation variation in the exact momentum that they get, they can tolerate that. Now, that was the core principle. So Koji made a whole theoretical notion about that. So a notion that there would be a macroscopic model that is this sort of model, and then you would translate it down in more conventional terms to the detailed arm and all the controllers that you have downstairs. And so downstairs, it will be more like conventional robots with control circuits and so on. And the concept would be that you describe the whole lower leg as a oscillatory system that has some effective eigenfrequency and damping and so on. And then that coupled to the task constraint would then create the macroscopic timing function. So if you look into these systems, they have a lot more components. It's more complex. I'm not going to explain that exactly. It's actually not all of it is public. Some of these robots, they have proprietary controls. We don't know exactly. I have here one video. I hope it works. I'm going to check that. Except I have it on the wrong screen. You're familiar with that. I think most of you are right. These dynamic machines. And so every leg here has that component, has a periodic device that does that. And then there are other controllers for lateral control. This is what you just saw is a combination of two things, right? It is a horizontal perturbation. So the system has to control that it's again back over the right position, but also all the legs have to stay in their rhythm. So this is not a one-leg hopping machine, it's a four-leg machine, and they are coordinated. And this means that the sequence of the timings must be right. And that's actually achieved by countless oscillators. We will come back to that later. So this is the feature is it runs over rough terrain, right? It doesn't have to make a precise analysis of where the leg falls and so on, because it has this inbuilt robustness of the periodic locomotion mode. You see that, right? And sometimes it misses a step and so on. It doesn't have a model of the staircase. It will just keep the time. This is actually remote controlled in the sense of the path planning, the pedestrian path planning. We discussed this is actually not autonomous. There's a joystick guy who's driving it, right? But there are vans where they do also something like vehicle integration. Now, there are even cooler things they do now with jumping over obstacles and so on. Each of these is actually a lot of effort to really get going. So it's all of that is position. Okay, there are lots of videos like that. I invite you to have a look at those. No, I think, how do I get back to my full screen thing here? Okay, good. So the first taste of these sort of things, we'll come back to that a little later. Yeah, so now you perhaps have a sense that, autonomous robotics timing is more than just a parametric, retune itself. Now, one of the challenges would be to go to discrete movement. We'll have a look at that. Now, in human movement, we didn't really talk about that so far, but when we're talking about reaching movement, discrete motor acts and support a chart and so on. In some sense, these can be done in open loop. We sometimes talk about realistic movements, as you can actually estimate that there might not be enough time, neural processing time, to make a feedback loop while you're making the movement. When you make a fast pointing movement, for instance, a fast catching movement. And so in some sense, it is possible to make a open loop movement where you just generate the plan in your brain or time course, right? And you just send that downstream. There's a lot of work currently that's not typically the case, that you do have feedback corrections, but that extreme case is possible. And for a long time, that was the dominant thought, that it's open loop dynamics. The kind of people I work with are actually interested in how that's done. We call it a neural dynamics, and I will talk a little bit about that and give you an exercise about that, how these time courses could emerge from, again, a dynamics that's actually implemented by neurons. And the attractive thing about that can actually be a way how this limit cycle can be generated, the stable oscillation that the roboticists implemented more technique. We'll come back to that. But before we go in there, just talk a little bit about what timing really means in human movement. It's more obvious. So timing really means that you arrive on time. You have a desire to achieve something in a certain given time. And when you're late, you're going to catch up to arrive at time. When you're early, you're going to slow down to arrive just in time. So that typically means that you're coordinating the movement with something like a percept when you catch a ball, or with some other limb, like the limbs of the like in robots. When one of these limbs has made a faster, earlier step because there was an obstacle that made that the leg hit the ground earlier, you have to make sure that the other leg now also does its movement faster to stay in the correct phase relationship. I formalize that a little later in a bit more precision. Right from the start in the nervous system, certainly this sort of timing requires a form of anticipation, as you know, in the nervous system. I don't know if you actually know, but I tell you, and in the nervous system, it's relatively sluggish. So there is some time delay between generating a sensory signal, for instance, a motor signal, for instance, in the motor cortex, and sending it down to the periphery, that meaning the spinal cord, and then activating the muscles and doing the movement. So that is of the order of at least 100 milliseconds. And so when you hit a piano key correctly, or you do any of the fancy times things we do, it's not enough for you to notice through sensory feedback that you're late. You have to anticipate that you're going to be late and correct. So that already shows it's a bit more sophisticated than just a simple controller. And I'll hint at a few of those solutions. Before I go there, I want to introduce a few notions to make this way of speaking more precise. And I'm in particular going to talk about absolute versus relative timing, and then talk about coordination, and I'll give you the solution in terms of coupled oscillators. So here's a sort of a conceptual picture about, this is from a paper that I'll invite you to read for the exercise. And you have to do a small part of that. The paper I wrote, I didn't cite it here. So absolute versus relative timing. So these are activation time traces. They are made up just for the illustration. Let's say you have some inner neural signal that has some time structure. And we're thinking now very naively of some threshold. When this neural signal goes above the threshold, then it does something, it drives the motor, make some decisions. So every time here, this is not a very good picture, just to illustrate the idea. I mean, this is not a good model. One has to do more than just there's a threshold, but just for the purpose of clarity, say, okay, whenever this threshold is pierced here, 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 something is emitted that makes a step or makes some movement or so. And so insert a lot of noise, which is typically the case, of course, in neural signals, but that could reflect perturbations from the outside, perceptual perturbations or whatever it is. And that would mean that the times when this threshold is pierced vary. So when you look at these times, then you see this distance here would be one cycle of whatever the one movement time, and then this would be second one, and very sensitive touch, but here the third one, and so on, right? This varies quite a lot. So we would call that absolute timing. That is really how many seconds does every cycle take, and then the variation of that would be the variation of absolute time. Here showed a second trace of such an oscillation, which is similar, something identical, also has quite variable absolute timing, but it has very precise relative timing. That is, if you're now looking at what the time difference is between the events in the corresponding signals, you see that that time difference dt is a small percentage of the cycle time. Here it is, and it does not vary a lot. If you look at these intervals, they are quite precise. It could be the other way around. I'm just showing that these two things can be different. That is, you can have a very variable absolute timing, but let's say if the other signal is just a copy of the first one, they will have perfect relative timing, right? And conversely, you could have two very nicely timed things, but the two are not at all coordinated. So if there's just a small error in one, it will not be corrected by the other one, and then they would drift apart over time. Arbitrarily. They could take on any phase relationship, right? So relative timing and absolute timing are a priori independent dimensions of a model like that, and we have to look at them separately. This relative timing is often measured by something called relative phase, that is the time difference as a percent of the cycle time, which can be, it's some periodic, right? If the event of one in the other cycle drifts through the whole cycle, then it's a reset, then you're in the next cycle, right? So it's a periodic signal. And that means it goes from 0 to 1, and with modulo operation, or typically we use a phase variable like from 0 to 2 pi or 360. It's an angular variable to represent the relative phase. And the absolute phase would be just how the time advances in each cycle is reset at every cycle. So you're thinking of time going on a circle. So you could describe it by would be on S1 for those who know this abstract stuff, on the circle as a mathematical object, which is closed, and you can use a sinus function or an angle to describe to parameterize that space. So absolute timing is relevant in some human activities. So in music, you're supposed to keep your rhythm, right, and not become fast and slower, in time estimation, predicting, and so on. In the laboratory, it's often tested by asking people to tap, just make a rhythm, tapping. Typically, you do this in a way where you set it up by metronomes, which is relative timing. You have to go with metronome. And then you turn off the metronome and have the so-called self-continuation or continuation paradigm. And it turns out that people are extremely good at that. So when we ask you to do that in the typical frequencies that you can do, it's actually only about an order of magnitude. You can go from fastest would be maybe, depending on the system, 3 to 5 hertz, and then down to below 1 hertz, 1 per second, you become quite variable, which are the moment. So in this little window, you can do it very well. Like within less than 10%, even down to 2% variation in cycle time. So it's quite good. So you can actually, in the laboratory, you can ask people to make a movement and then set it up in a certain speed, and then they will be able to consistently do that for a while. They have some drift, but they can do it well. So it reflects a property of how that's done. Yeah. There is this curious effect, sometimes called the Wing-Christopherson law, that shows that precision. So here is the estimated variance, and I can just say it can be done in this paradigm, it's about 5%. There's an interesting, don't want to explain the details of that, but what you can actually do is you can look at correlations in timing and distinguish between the clock variation and the motor variation. Imagine if you have you eject periodically this movement signal, then the durations of the movement are affected by the intermediate signal. So if you have one cycle, in the signal that ends that cycle ends a little early. If the clock keeps running, the next cycle would be longer, right? Because you sort of shifted the motor event to be, let's say, early would be, maybe you have shifted to later. But if the clock keeps running, then the next one should be shorter, because now the clock is going to miss the next cycle, and if next time it doesn't have that delay, it will be shorter. And this would be a negative autocorrelation that you would observe, and that is actually observed in an experiment. You see a negative autocorrelation. So there's some hint that there's an underlying clock that's going at high precision, and some of the variance that we see is actually just this execution error that you do when you go down. So that's a very old picture that was established. And I actually theoretically treat that in that paper. But you don't have to look into that too much. So this is a whole field of research that's been done, still being done a lot. For instance, when you have cerebellar patients, the cerebellum, the Kleinhirn, this big, it's small, but it has a lot of neurons here in the back. Well, somehow, not right here. It's sort of somewhat inside here. That is very critical for that. And some people have certain diseases there, and then they are losing the fine control of their movement there, so making jerky movements. They're worse at that, but they still can move. So the theoretical notion for this sort of precision in timing and so on that has become established is to talk about neural oscillators. I mean, often the mathematical model is just oscillators, and then whether they're neural or not, that's another question. So I didn't formally introduce that notion, but it is a straightforward generalization of attractor dynamics as we discussed it in the first part of the lecture series. In fact, when we talked in the dynamic systems tutorial about the Hopf bifurcation, then we already had an encounter with that object. Remember the Hopf bifurcation, if this is its normal form, the fixed point becomes unstable and a stable limit cycle emerges. A stable limit cycle is simply a periodic solution that is stable. And it's some subtleties about that. It's stable in the sense that its returns to the periodic solution after a perturbation or converges to it. And that means it takes on the amplitude or the spatial shape of the oscillation and the frequency of the oscillation. The subtlety, it's not necessarily ending up in the same phase. You know? So if you have the oscillator already running and you perturb the oscillator, then it will return to the oscillator, but maybe its phase shifted over the original trajectory, because there's no absolute time marker in that oscillator. And that's actually cool, because if you couple different oscillators like that, you can actually arrange that then through that coupling, they take on particular temporal orders, and there's some flexibility in that. We'll come back to that. So this slide was in the dynamic tutorial. You don't have to understand it in detail to follow the rest. Neural oscillators, that's what I'll ask you to look at in the exercises, are using a stronger constraint. This is a polynomial equation, third order, that is very nicely solvable and so on. That's why it's called the normal form. But the nervous system can't necessarily implement arbitrary equations like that. The neural equations, in the winter semester I teach about that, have sort of a generic form. They always, if U is a neural activation variable, it always has this minus U term that comes from the membrane. Has some constant here, which we call resting level, and then these F's are sigmoid functions that is transmitting activation only when U is positive and not when U is negative. And so this would be self-excitation of this excitatory variable. This is an inhibitory variable because it shows up as a negative variable here in the first equation. And it might have also, it is driven by the excitatory variable. So it's the excitation drives the inhibition, and the inhibition inhibits excitation. But this leads to oscillations, or some examples of how that leads to oscillations. And I invite you in the exercise to actually try that out with our online simulator to play around and figure that out. So it's sort of intuitive. Sometimes people call that the restaurant cycle. So you have excitation goes up, and once it's going up above threshold, so positive, it can drop up inhibition. Once inhibition is above threshold, when this resting level makes it's not immediately above threshold, then it can start to inhibit the excitation. And when it starts to inhibit the excitation, excitation goes down, and then it no longer drives the inhibition. The inhibition is still up. Inhibition decays, it no longer inhibits the excitation. Excitation can go back and the cycle returns, right? Restaurant cycle, because this idea you have a really good restaurant. Initially, it's cheap and good, and then a lot of people go there, and then it becomes expensive, and then it becomes lazy and no longer good, and people stop going there, and then it has to lower its price, but it's still bad, and then up to sometimes it becomes good again. Oh, so some story like that. And so this is a different mathematical picture. That's why I'm making this difference, because this picture from the normal form from the Hopf theorem is a case of weak nonlinearity, which is mathematically nice to solve. That is here, the oscillator really comes from the linear part. This here is the funny way of writing a harmonic oscillator. It's you can write it as a second order system. So it has these sinusoidal solutions. Omega is the term omega, that is the frequency of the oscillator. If you have a negative alpha, it's a damped oscillator that will die out. And all that the nonlinearity does is insert some energy into that. So essentially the timing is given by the linear system. So no, it's like a pendulum that you drive a little bit, and the drive doesn't determine the cycle time. The cycle time is still given by the oscillator, by the pendulum, but you just keep it going. Example like that will be perhaps the grandfather clock that goes like that. And the escapement there, if you know that, that inserts the energy, keeps it going. But the timing is really from the pendulum. And so that's mathematically nice and has all kinds of uses, but that's not how neurons actually work. This is sometimes called a relaxation oscillator, because what it really does is that it has attractors on and off attractors for both variables. And the system goes to these attractors, and as it approaches, it notices it's a saddle point, and then actually they're not really attractors. They're only attracting in a half plane, and once you're there, you go to the other attractor and so on. And the exercise invites you to think that through. And there's a paper I'll make available discusses that. And that's very typical for neural oscillators, which means they are much harder to tune. A linear oscillator, like a pendulum, you can tune, and the grandfather clock can just make pendulum longer, shorter, and electronic circuits, you just have to control the linear force, which is usually the thing that the stiffness of the spring or whatever it is, or of the electronic circuit in more modern atomic clocks, for instance. Atomic clocks is still a different story. But roughly speaking, they're easier to tune. Well, these neural oscillators are not so easy to tune because space and time are very coupled. And so if you make the attractors at higher activation, it takes longer to go there, but they also change the spatial shape. And in fact, if you make the amplitude larger, the time only increases a little bit because it's just going to be faster in approaching that fixed point. And that is a property of the nervous system. In the nervous system, these timers that we are aware of are relatively rigid. And that might be also one of the reasons why we have a limited range over which we can do this time movement. When we go outside of that range, essentially when you try to do something much slower, you're using a faster oscillation and just count. I do 5 times everything. And in the other limits, you're hitting the limits of your mechanics. Drummers and so on can do faster stuff, but that's by using mechanical resonance of the device. So they're essentially doing it passively, only giving some elastic support for inserting energy. So the oscillation comes from the physical device, the drum or whatever it is. Yeah, so have a chance to look into that. That's the core of all the stuff I showed earlier, the Rybert stuff and Kolicek, and all the models I'll be showing you later. I mean, not all of them use neural oscillators, some of them use just any equation, but it's the sort of idea. So limit cycle is the generalization of a fixed point, so of a fixed point attractor. Mathematically, there is actually a transformation, so-called Poincare resection. You can look at an oscillator only every cycle by looking at when the variable cuts through a plane, and then it always goes again through the plane periodically, and it's actually a fixed point which is connected through another path variable that oscillates. And there's a mathematical relationship, so you can characterize uniquely an oscillator by the Poincare resection. And in that sense, fixed point and oscillators are very closely related. This is a whole mathematical field. It's very fun. The Scheinerman book that I mentioned discusses that, but you don't need that. Just tell you so no, I've heard about it. So these kind of models do actually account for this difference between clock and motor variability and the reaction time and so on. To go through the details. That's in that paper if you're interested. It's too specific in my view to discuss here. Good. So that's absolute timing, and we are good at absolute timing. Now, so there are whole other domains in perception, for instance, pitch analysis and so on. We're also using things like that. There are certain circuits that enter in resonance with temporal varying signals. Now, relative timing is very closely tied because we are pretty much always coordinating. So intuitively, when you lock a mode, we are bipeds. So for us, it's really critical that the interlimb coordination works, not fall over, even though you can jump, right? You can move with both legs. We also have intralimb coordination. That is, the joints are all periodically varying, and make sure that, when the knee is bent, you're in a certain phase of the cycle. And if you stumble, then you try to recover that timing to do that. Speaking is an extraordinarily well-coordinated act where the articulators have to go to the right place, anticipating again at the right moment in time. This has been studied in a lot of detail. There are phenomena there that are called co-articulation, where you're essentially anticipating that the next phoneme I have to go there, so I'm already positioning myself to do that right and do the previous syllable a little bit differently depending on context. So this shows a little bit the subtlety of anticipation. It's a famous experiment that was done. I think I don't have that in my slides. No, but it's very cool. I was in a speech lab in my early days for a while, and so I was a participant in one of those experiments. Kind of interesting. In one variant of that experiment, the milder one, you are speaking, and you have to say something friendly. It's a barb again, it's a barb again, so on. Or it's a bars again, a bars. And when you do that, they have insert a little thing, like a little plate that they can pull your lip down. Well, why you do that? But surprising to you when they do that. And it's quite fascinating, when you do barb, it's a bilabial closure. The lips have to close to the lip. And while bars, when you say bars, you don't have to do that. And what you find is that when you are perturbing the lip in a barb, there is a compensatory reaction where the upper lip goes down. You can voluntarily, it's even kind of difficult to do, to make the upper lip go down, but the nervous system can do that, and people do achieve the closure. Well, if you do the same perturbation when you say bars, then you don't see that. I mean, there are a whole bunch of variants of that. And that shows that speech articulatory apparatus is coordinated in this way that is keeping certain events invariant. You might wonder, why is that the case? We're not expecting to be perturbed like that. But of course, the variable context in which we have to do the speech requires exactly that sort of thing, right? Of keeping certain events invariant under initial condition. And one of the provisions, mastication, right? If you eat, you move stuff, sometimes you bite your tongue and then you see the failure of coordination. So you're shifting stuff around. That's why eating and speaking is maybe not so ideal, because one is a strong provision for the other, although we can roughly manage that, right? And then, of course, rhythm production, so on. Now, these are all periodic examples. So far, I've always talked about periodic examples, but we can do this in discrete movements. So discrete movement means one movement act, right? Followed by usually another. A sequence of movements is typically thought of as a sequence of discrete motor acts. If every movement is different, goes to a different goal. So when you reach and grasp, for instance, that's discrete. Right? You reach and reach and grasp, hold it, and then you do something else with it. And you can do that in a bimanual fashion, right? You can really do things. So you coordinate the two limbs during a discrete movement, and you coordinate the fingers during the grasp. And it becomes most dramatic in catching, intercepting, right? Catching means that you are at the right time, in the right position. In fact, this is interesting. You could think, well, I could just be there and wait for the ball. But we don't do that. So typically we don't do that. And when the ball comes later, we slow down to just run time because we have these coordination mechanisms. Very likely, we don't have this a computation of discrete motor plans that will be triggered in some way. I can demonstrate to you discrete movement coordination. It's a bit difficult to do it for the online folks and you at the same time. I'll do it maybe first separately. So for instance, I can do a short movement and a long movement. And there is a law that says that, so Fitz's law, that the long movement is going to take longer than the short. That just depends on the precision requirement. You can make the long movement not very precise and the short movement precise and make the movement times very different. So you can sort of get an intuition for that, perhaps listening fast movement. And then you are just initiating the two movements at the same time. Then you can't prevent yourself from coordinating. The two movements will then have approximately the same movement time, right? So short movement, fast movement. So there's a serious experiment about that called Goodman. I worked with some of those folks, and that will be an example of coordination of discrete movements because you can do it similar time. So by coordination in these contexts, we're really talking about just the timing. Right? We're not talking about the goal achievement. And in this case, we're assuming that the movement hits the corresponding goal. So it's not the amplitude that we're coordinating. It's that we arrive at that amplitude at the right time. So it's formally defined as the maintenance of stable timing relationships between components of voluntary movement. That's why you say it's timed is a very appropriate word. In German, that's not good word. It's temporally, zeitlich geregelt or something like that, or temporally controlled. I already gave you that example, this Greco-Abscat, so that's the word I talked about, speech, German speech. And so human movement tends to be coordinated. You coordinate all kinds of things. For instance, when you grasp, you coordinate the opening and closing of your hand with the transport, the approach to the object. Like when you're approaching, you're opening your hand and then closing your hand. A famous experiment where they would perturb that by, for instance, removing the object so that it takes longer to reach it, or a guy in the Netherlands, Sabelsberg, he had a balloon that he was blowing up or decreasing in size, so you needed more opening or more closing. And what you find there is that then you couple the two. That is, if you remove, you take longer to open. You slow down your opening because now you have more time to open. Now, even though you could open it like a stupid robot would open the hand, move all there and then just close when you're there, but you don't do that. You coordinate it. But even though it's not strictly speaking necessary. So that's pervasive, and we think it's pervasive because that's how movement generation actually works in the nervous system. That we have these timers, and they are coupled, and that's how they bring about that. And I'll explain that in more detail now. The only exception is locomotion. The thing that we discussed in the initial lecture, right? When you displace yourself through the environment, we assume then that you can decouple the speed from the path, go at different speeds, the path. And that is a good approximation. These guys in the Warren lab, where I reviewed the pedestrian movement, they were well fitted by that. So you can do that. In fact, when you're slowed down because you're going around a tight bend, then you're just going to arrive a little later, right? And if you have an obstacle, you're going to arrive a little later. You can voluntarily compensate for that. So one form of doing that is when people run to catch a ball, then they will actually make sure they arrive at the right time. Now, while they're watching, so a little different mode there. And sometimes you see like a small kid and an adult, and the kid will fall behind and then make some extra steps. It's not very good kind of coordination, but you still can do that. But that would be the one thing where you don't automatically coordinate, and that's very interesting, right? That's the vehicle part where the sensor information comes from the moving sensor versus the reaching part where the sensor information is not does not is not directly coming from the moving effector. Okay. Now there is this notion that I already hinted that these time movements are coordinated by coupling. And I want to give you the critical experiment. I was involved in that, so I'm also a little bit in love with that. It was my first venture into psychology, but it's also a very cool little experiment that shows that provides a basis for that assumption. So to explain to you then, I'll have to talk about two basic patterns of coordination that you have. So typically when you look at movement, I'm talking now about two effectors to make it simple, but it actually also applies to perception action patterns when you time your move into a metronome pieces. Then you have in-phase and anti-phase patterns, very, very common. So for instance, here you would have in-phase that will be the homologous muscles are co-contracting, and that will be anti-phase, alternating, right? If it's to a rhythm, you would call in-phase, the tapping on the beat, and the on-phase, anti-phase would be syncopation, right? That would be, if one of them is the metronome, that would be syncopation, and that would be. So these are very basic patterns you observe very often. You could think of the gaits of quadrupeds. They have trot on pace would be alternation of the limbs, and then the gallop would approximately be in phase. And you find that in other animals. Now, they are probably anatomically come from excitatory versus inhibitory coupling. So excitatory coupling makes that neurons tend to fire synchronously. If they're mutually coupled, you can imagine if they burst to that. If they are inhibitory coupled, when one bursts, the other is suppressed from bursting, and then it can burst only when the first one is off, that would lead to antiphase. So it's in the sense, and knowing that nervous system excitation inhibition are the two coupling mechanisms, it's sort of generic to get that. So a hand-waving argument, there's a lot of work making that more concrete. So in this experiment, Scott Kelso looked at these two patterns, how they relate. So he essentially was thinking about doing a laboratory version of gait transitions. When a horse goes slowly, it trots maybe, walks first, and then trots, and then switches to the gallop at some point. And that, of course, is a complex thing. I'll come back to that at the last slide, because mechanics also matter. But a laboratory version where you're just focusing in on the timing aspect and not on the control and the masses and the accelerations would be one where you can move freely at these different frequencies, and you use fingers to do that, because fingers are not mechanically coupled, they're negligible mass. So it's a different thing if you're moving your arms or your legs, the center of mass might be moving and there's mechanical coupling. But here it will be just nervous coupling. And you can move them pretty fast. This is the fastest movements you can make with the fingers. And what he did is ask people to do an anti-phase pattern in various ways, or an in-phase pattern, and then increase the frequency. There was a metronome that would increase the frequency, but within a range that you can achieve. And he would typically find that when you're in phase, you can just stay in phase, but when you're anti-phase, you will switch to in phase. You only switch to in phase if you really follow the metronome. The other thing is that you then maybe just don't follow the metronome or stop moving. But you ask people, main priority is do the frequency right, then they will typically switch to in phase. And so there was a notion that would reveal a limit of coordination, a instability. And he came to our lab in Stuttgart, where I was doing my PhD in physics for some reason, and we discussed. And I actually predicted that if this was really an instability, he called it a phase transition, which was a metaphor, which was quite right. Then certain things would have to be true, namely a loss of This is redundant. A loss of um, yeah. We give you before I go there. Let me just show a few phenomenological things. It doesn't matter if you look at it at the muscle level, right, or at the kinematic level. The muscles alternate and then they fire at the same time. And yeah, and there are different ways to measure the rate of phase. Like here, for instance, you see that every certain events are picked, like here the peaks are picked, and then the other peaks of the other hand are in between, and then here they fall on top of each other. But you can also estimate the phase in some complicated way for each individual finger, like position against velocity gives you a phase variable, and then it goes around, and you can do that for the other one and subtract these two ones, and you have a continuous estimate of relative phases. All kinds of technologies done to do that. I mean, whichever you do, you can find that instability. So when Scott Kessler came down to our lab, he had all this discourse, but I realized he didn't really know exactly what he was talking about. And so I outlined to him what had to be true for this to be really an instability. So to say that there is something dynamic and coupling and so on. And he went, so this was the variance should increase near the instability. You formalize it, but maybe you have an intuition for that if you have a little noise source, if you're less stable, cannot resist noise as much, and therefore you will see more variance. Or relaxation time will increase. That is, if you look at how long it takes to go back to the attractor, it takes longer when it's less stable than not. We didn't really formalize that in the tutorial, but it's obvious. Now I'll come back to that. And I actually thought that was not going to be true. So it's like to refute that idea. But he went back to his lab and did that with someone called John Schwartz, with whom I ended up working a lot. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, actually, had cancer. Beautiful work where they studied the variance and they also studied relaxation time. That was the heroic part. They had the fingers, they actually did it this way for some reason. And then they mounted the fingers in a apparatus where a motor would perturb the finger somewhat strongly, because if you don't perturb strongly, then the clock is not reset, and it's just the mechanics, right? You have to sort of give it a little startle here, but not to rip off the finger or something. And here you see the little torque impulse that perturbs you see the corresponding finger is being perturbed. This velocity, this is the finger, and here's another one. And you can already see with the naked eye, when you do this perturbation in in-phase, you have a much shorter time to come back to the cycle than if you do it in the anti-phase. You have to have ways of how to do that precisely. And that's what they found roughly. That is, they found that as you increase frequency, the variability of relative phase, just as the standard deviation estimated in some way across time, increases for antiphase, but not for in-phase. After the transition, it drops to the in-phase pattern. And the relaxation time increases and then drops to in-phase at the same time. In fact, here's some experimental trace of individuals. They all look like that. Yes, that's me. I have the most beautiful curve, perhaps because I knew it was supposed to be true. I don't know. No, when you do that, you're totally confused. You don't know what you're doing. And this is the aggregate curve across many participants. This is the variance. The filled are antiphase and the full are in phase, and that's for relaxation time. In fact, there is even a quantitative prediction here, because you can take from this ratio, you can predict that ratio. One is the square root of the other, and you can, with some constant, and you can actually really test that prediction. And we had other things we were able to predict. So that's an evidence for a loss of stability, and that evidence that stability was there before the stability was lost. And this coupled oscillator picture explains that perfectly, and a bunch of models that do that, right? So roughly speaking, that means you have these neural oscillators, and they're coupled in the sense that the oscillator number 2 is an input to the oscillator number 1, and the oscillator number 1 is an input to the oscillator number 2, always through the sigmoid, and that will lead to them aligning their time courses. So for instance, if one of those lags behind, it will then accelerate the other one to no, it will delay the other one to also lag behind, or it's mutual, so they will come back in phase. It can even come back within a single cycle, because the notion is that you would get to discrete movement. So an oscillator also creates a discrete movement, but it's an oscillator that's only on for a single cycle. So within that cycle, you turn it off. And we have developed models that really do that well. That's how we do robotic motion now, where it's only a single oscillation. It's actually in velocity space. But while that oscillation is going, it has this capacity to coordinate. That's also what happens in the other machines. In fact, it turns out that periodic movement is a sequence of discrete movements, and it makes actually neural sense. And Lei will show that movements are neurally, the different neurons drive the movements in different directions. So if you make a movement, the change direction is actually an alternation of two movements from the point of the neurons. And so each of these half movements is one cycle of an underlying oscillator that's turned off, and then another oscillator comes on, and so on. And these half cycles can be coordinated. And so when you couple two oscillators like that, you can look at the relative phase of the oscillators, and you can then derive that they will have an attractor. So I said previously that the phase of an oscillator is arbitrary, right? When you start up your limit cycle, and you can test that in the simulation, it will converge, and where it is in absolute terms depends on where it came from, right? When you start locomoting, it depends on how you initially, when you started, or where exactly you started. And if you perturb, then you're going to be shifted a little bit in phase. And that means the phase is actually an unstable variable. That is, within the limit cycle, there is one unstable direction, which is or marginal stable direction, is actually where on the limit cycle you are. Now, if you imagine it goes around and you just hold it for a moment and leave it, then it will keep going, but it will not catch up where it previously was, has another memory than where it previously was. And that means that if you look at the relative phase of two oscillators, it has the equation phi dot equals 0. The relative phase is this flat curve because they are unstable. There's no coupling. And by making the coupling, you can make that an attractor. And coupling is just some force there, and that will generically have some zero crossing, and that will go there. If it's symmetric, then it will make in-phase and anti-phase, but it can also make other phases. If one oscillator is a little bit faster than the other, then it will make some other effects. And that's sort of the generic principle of how that happens. And you can then derive from coupling functions like that the result in dynamics is the relative phase as a function of the rate of change as a function of relative phase. So it's a dynamical system in relative phase as a variable. And that can be derived from these oscillators. And you have two attractors, the in-phase and the anti-phase, and the anti-phase becomes unstable. And if it becomes unstable, now the slope here becomes smaller, that will lead to fluctuation. So if you think of fluctuations as random insertions into the rate of change, this means this curve goes up and down in a way, stochastically, like this amount of noise, and that will translate into little noise for relative phase when the curve is steep, and more noise for the relative phase when the slope is flat. That's why when it's flatter, you have more fluctuations. And similar for relaxation time, right? The linear approximation, remember, is the relaxation time. It takes the exponential time course that's given by the slope of that to relax. And so when the slope is smaller, it just takes longer to relax for the same distance. And that's how, as you go to instability, the relaxation time goes up. It's sometimes called critical slowing down and critical fluctuation. That comes from the analogy with phase transitions in equilibrium physics. It's not exactly, it's more a metaphor. Sometimes that's used. So that is sort of empirical proof that this picture of coupled oscillators is good for coordination. In the meantime, this has been done 15,000 times in all kind of variants. You can also see that people follow metronomes, see the same phenomena. They go out of syncopation. So apparently a test of whether you're a good drummer is how well you can keep syncopation. And some not so good drummers will fall into syncopation, into in phase. I don't know exactly how that works. My son is actually a drummer, but it's not, it's more a skill. It's not like an intellectual thing to talk about. So there's a whole literature on that. Good. So that's really where some of these ideas come from. There was a strong interchange between this sort of literature has a much broader. I just emphasized our contributions that are empirical. There's also work on central pattern generators and neural mechanisms for that and animal motion. Bodycheck was more tying into the animal motion side of it. That all are around that. So my last couple of slides are about learning from that for robotics. So it's a little bit the more precise versions of what I showed initially. So we ourselves did work along these lines. For instance, with someone called Christina Santos. We did a model where a robot arm intercepts a ball. It was all in simulation. And these are the complicated equations that we came up with where the oscillator, this is the Hopf oscillator in a particular form, and it shows up here, but it also has a fixed point generating term at the initial position and at the final position. So what we did is we had an initial fixed point, and then we make that unstable, and there's some variable here that turns it off. And then at the same time, we make this one go. And then if we're getting close enough to the final point, we turn this one on and this one off. And that's how the discrete aspect comes about. And while this is going, we are making sure that it is coupled to some sensory input that then makes that it exactly does the right thing. And I'll show you some simulations here. So the switching is also done by dynamic system. It's sort of a neural dynamics in a way. It just does the switch. We don't have to understand that fully. And so here's an example of this going. For instance, here, the positional variable that will be driving the pedal. Which sets the ball is here, this black line. Velocity variable is the other one. The neuron switching the movement on versus off, right? These are the positions, initiation and termination of the movement. And from that, we create some inner variables that represent whether you are currently in movement state or not. And then you can show that this can then work with perturbations. So for instance, you have an estimate of the time to contact. You want to intercept the ball. The time to contact would be the time it takes the ball to reach your paddle if it goes at constant velocity. And by having sensory errors, we just insert noise into this, but in an experiment, you would have potentially the ball could actually be accelerated by air or flowing by some obstacles, or it could be just a sensory error. And what we want the system to do is be robust under that. And there are a couple of examples here where there would be real perturbations where the time to contact is predicted to, for instance, reach 0 here earlier than predicted. And that would then drive these variables around. And the end point was not, the actual contact was not as predicted due to the accumulation of such error. But the system still does then hit the ball at the right time. So this was just a simulation study. We then did a study a couple of years later here in Bochum. It's kind of hard to see, where we quite a sophisticated thing, where we had a vehicle that was supposed to do that. That is a vehicle that goes from an initial position to a target in a desired time. This is a cable. It's a small Kepler robot. And we wanted the vehicle to take the same amount of time, approximately at least, independent of its path. So if it is deviated by an obstacle, it should accelerate to catch up. That's just a principle that we try to demonstrate. And that was based on something like an online upthing. You have to reshape the oscillator in this case. It's not just enough to have the phase, right? Because you really have to go faster if you fall behind. So you have to reshape the oscillator so that the remaining time is enough to cover the rest of the path. You can figure that out and insert that into the equation, and it does that, right? And this is the sort of thing that this lab by Haute Billiard that I mentioned earlier has perfected. So they have these robots that catch objects, like a bottle, and then they will catch the bottle. And they do all of this, so the core idea is the same, but it's much, much better done. So they have, a model of the object and how it, so they can predict the object and learn that from learning material. And then they have a predictor of how to best grasp the object and have the pose and how to grasp what class configuration you need. They also learn that. And they have the arm motion dynamics so that they can anticipate enough. And all of this runs at 100 hertz, this runs at 500 hertz. You can imagine it's really very sophisticated. And so the core idea is really just that the time courses that are generated from this estimator are coupled to the sensory information to make this just on time. And so this is just an illustration that when you turn off that coupling, this will be a perturbation that you induce on the input. And when it's uncoupled, the oscillator would just keep going to its movement. And when it's coupled, it actually really reacts to the perturbation and follows the signal. And I think that this movie might work, except that I might not have done do this by hand because I think I didn't insert the code here into the slide. Yeah, this is the robot. This is the arm and casting buttons. Is it superhuman, by the way?
How to predict.
No, I think they're just talking a lot. But at some point, this is Ottilia who invented the system.
Inhabited environments where things can
So
change.
for accent. And I think we have another, just talking. The good part is here right at the beginning. Lausanne.
We teach a robot how to
And
predict
their thing is
objects.
all these
So that we teach a robot where to grab. And
Object catching is in the way.
So we did oops, again, I have this problem. How do I do that? This. Yeah, there, I'm back to the slides. So we have a version of that is theoretically much simpler and cleaner in a way. It doesn't have all this learning stuff. That was published a little earlier, but it's of course not as cool as their stuff. That illustrates this idea. So we did it with our little robot, which we'll see in a moment. The old one, which is very slow and can only make very slow movements because it's a very bad robot, frankly. A modular robot we built ourselves. So let's see here, this is what it looks like. Quite an awkward robot. And because it was so slow, we didn't do catching. We did intercepting a ball that runs down a plane so that it has time to. In fact, even the fastest movement would not hit the ball very hard. That was, well, OTBI had the cool lightweight robot arm that we now also have. This is decades ago. It was published 2013, but it was done maybe 2005 or so. And so, it doesn't reach performance at all. But here you can understand a little bit better what happens. So here you have a ball running down the incline, and we define a hitting line in terms of which we compute the time to contact. We have a camera that tracks the ball. It's just a Kalman filter standard technique of how to estimate the trajectory of the ball. We predict the time to contact, and we predict where it will hit. And then the robot moves the racket to a certain place that's where on the baseline where it would hit, and then makes a hitting movement vertical to the plane to transport the arm. And that's all done by a dynamical system. It's the same kind of dynamical system as in the Santos thing, where there is this initial posture term, there is the timing term, the movement term, and there is a input parameter that's not so important. And the timing can be tuned to the time to contact. So we can compute how fast we have to go there, given how much time we have there. We want to be just in time at the right place. There's also a whole network, it's actually a neural network that controls the different phases. So there are three different things. There is going to the correct baseline position at a critical distance, making this movement, and then going back to baseline. And these three have a switch depending on whether you currently have predicted a time to contact that is within your capacities or not, whether the ball is predicted to go or not. All of which is autonomous. There is no no algorithm. It's all just a dynamical system that's solved. That's our ambition always to do that. And so that can do two kinds of forms of robustness. So in one case, we have the ball come in here, we insert it here, not by hand. So it's really a measured time to contact, and we hit it. And then in another case, we have a little obstacle where we deflect the ball a little bit, and it just has to adjust its parameters and also its timing to move to the new position and hit at a new moment in time. And that is demonstrated here. And so I'll just very slow, but that makes you see what happens. So you will see that initially it tries to go here, and now it updates. Right? So initially, and then it corrects. And because it's also slow, you can see it, but of course it's not really extremely cool. But it's sort of the same idea as the bottle catching. Except this was all tuned by hand, and it's just with the parameters we determined ourselves. And the other thing is that it can also do this at the level of decision making. This is something I didn't really explain, how these neurons that turn on and off the different phases are also dynamical systems that are also going to attractors, and we can switch those attractors around. So this was a case where we inserted the ball. This would be the normal hitting, and then we had it interact with an obstacle that would make it move away again. So there's no time to contact. And then the paddle would go back to its home position, give up on the reach. And then when the ball then falls again, it goes to a new interception location. So you see that here. So it goes back to baseline, and now a new reach is inserted. You see how weak the problem is. Yeah. This was Farod Ubati who did that on it. So in the autonomous robotics, timing is best framed in these terms: stable oscillators that are coupled to coordination, both with perceived events and across different limbs. So that gives the timing this robustness that you need. And the interesting thing is it works both for rhythmic movement and locomotor systems, just rhythmically, so they don't have this whole issue of turning on and off the movements. But you can also do this with discrete motor acts. And I didn't even explain exactly how that works, because that requires neurodynamics, which I didn't teach you in the summer semester, and how to turn on and off things. You can imagine that you could emulate that with an algorithm, like a finite state machine, but the critical thing will be to stabilize against noise, because the sensory noise, I showed that here a little bit, there would be some sensory noise where you're uncertain about what to do. And what you have to do is stabilize the decision. That is, say, either I go or I now go to another state. And you can't undo that decision here. You would 15 times switch back and forth. But the dynamic system makes that a steady state. That's why it's important to make these decisions about going or not going, also dynamical systems with stability properties. That is actually routinely done now by roboticists, for instance, robots that interact with matter. Someone called Sami Haddadian, for instance, does this now in Munich. He used to be in Hanover, where they are interacting with surfaces. And when the robot detects that the surface ends, it has to switch to a new control mode where it no longer presses against the surface. And that detection is noise laden. You get some signals, and you're uncertain near the decision if you're on the table or not. And you need to make a decision. And once you're there, you need to keep it. If not, the robot will get into some unstable state where it tries and then switches back and so on. Good. So last slide, I want to put this into the general perspective. And so the more general perspective is that this sort of timing requirement interacts with all kinds of things. And this is one signature of autonomous robotics as it's done more classically and maybe more human-aligned or neurally aligned robotics. So in robotics, you really try to uncouple everything. You have time plans, you have spatial plans, you have control, and maybe you have forces periphery. You want to make sure that they don't affect each other. That's why you want to have perfect control, where you want to have plans that are invariant, that just depend on spatial things that you know that are not depending on what you achieved and so on. But in autonomous robotics and in human movement, that's not true. So for instance, when you're when you're moving in a time environment, then you make a plan, but the things that you interact with might change because there's a perturbation or some event happening. Just think of soccer or a game like that, right? It would be changing all the time. You call this online updating. While you're already preparing moving, you have to update. And it will also depend, and similar for control, right? You have a somewhat sluggish controller because you're a soft controller, and that will mean that you have to do this anticipation. That is, if you want to accelerate, you have to know earlier. Now I have to insert 4 so that I accelerate, so that by the time it becomes relevant, I'm in the correct velocity state. And that might even reach across different movements. That's what co-articulation is. We showed this in switching movements, that you have co-articulation in the sense that as you move to a target, you're already anticipating what your next target is and exactly how you move to that target. And that's how you achieve that. With soft control, you can still fulfill such requirements. So in the nervous system, these things are not so neatly separated. They're all interacting, and that's why it's sort of one big coupled dynamic system. That's sort of the theme that we're pursuing in our neural theory of human movement generation. It's an ongoing research project. Yeah, I only show some highlights of that, and currently there's still work in that direction in my lab. Good. That's timing for you. I'll be happy to take some questions. There are any. Yes, please.
What this stands the MC hop for? Like I know what the term where it appears it's for, but what's the word for what it is short from?
Hopf is the name of a mathematician, Edmund, I think, who proved the theorem about the bifurcations of fixed points with one codimension, the Hopf theorem. So that was done in 1930s. It's kind of interesting. It's not so old. So he classified, identified these 4 ways of how fixed points can become unstable, and one has to be more precise about. So that one eigenvalue, the real part of an eigenvalue changes sign, and it can be maximally, if it's complex, it's the complex conjugate eigenvalues that change sign, the real part of which changes sign. And that leads to the 4 bifurcations: the transcritical, the pitchfork, the tangent, and this one with the oscillation is the Hopf. So the Hopf oscillator is that sort of the generic form that in this, in which you can describe that bifurcation. So mathematically, it says these are the 4 things that can happen. And then you can say, if I go arbitrarily close to the bifurcation, then if the distance from the bifurcation, you use the relative coordinates, so relative to the bifurcation point, and you can make a Taylor expansion, and then you only need to keep the lowest terms that make the normal form, the lowest terms that create the bifurcation. And so that equation is that normal form, that simplest polynomial equation that has that bifurcation that we proved. That's where that comes from. And now the Hopf, that concrete equation is sometimes called the Hopf equation, even though I think it was only later that was introduced. So it's really just the name of a researcher. That's a piece of very beautiful mathematics. So interesting that this stuff is not so old. The classification of instabilities, of bifurcations, Hopf was a major step forward in the I think it was like 32 that he published this theorem. And there are many more bifurcations. Now, these are just the simple ones, but you can have more degenerate ones where multiple eigenvalues change sign. Some of you might have heard about René Thom's catastrophe theory. Anybody heard about that? Sometimes it was very fashionable in the 80s. So he did work on so-called potential systems. It's a subclass of dynamic systems that have potentials, and classified. He got the field model for that. He classified a vast set of such of bifurcations in these systems. And he called those catastrophes, and they're often used metaphorically because they have this property that very small differences in the equation or the initial conditions can lead to macroscopic differences. For more general dynamical systems, this classification still hasn't been achieved. That is, there's no systematic classification of what kind of bifurcations can happen, when you give up when you allow for degeneracy. Degeneracy means more than one parameter has a specific value. And you can have infinitely many parameters that have specific values. So this is the codimension of the bifurcations. Maybe it's a complicated to explain, but I'm just saying it's a mathematical field that is still under development. There's still new stuff being done. And this is connected to chaos theory, right? Some of you might have heard about that. It was very fashionable 20 years ago. It's still ongoing work, but somehow the enthusiasm that everything is like that, it has maybe waned a little bit. So these are deterministic dynamical systems. So we're not talking about noise, that have the property that they are sensitively dependent on initial condition. So you have a infinitesimally different initial condition, you have a different future. There's the butterfly effect, some of you have heard of that. And there's a climate model, very crude climate model, which is or it's not a climate model, it's an atmospheric model, which just has one equation for the entire layer of air and some kind of flows there. And that simplified model shows chaos. And that means that there might be a principal reason why weather patterns are hard to predict. So that's why it's intuitive why that's important. People have tried to apply these kind of ideas to nervous systems to see if some of the stuff we do is like that. With limited empirical success, problem is when you want to analyze such things, you need very long time scales to see if the regularity is really chaos or is it just noise. And typically in nervous systems, if you look at a larger time scale, another process comes in, like fatigue, right? You do this and then after some time you become slower because you're tired or adapt or you learn and so on. It's very difficult to keep these systems constant, so you can't really prove that it's a dynamical system in that sense. So the best application of these kind of ideas are in what is called fractal dynamics. Anybody heard about that? Fractal dynamics. So these power law relationships that are different from exponential. Right? As I was just saying, exponential decay of correlation or anything is reflecting of linear systems, and when you have non-exponential, it's very special. It's something where the linear term is zero, right? That's like you're at a bifurcation in terms of the linear term, but then the nonlinear terms can make that you're not. And these fractal systems, they give some robustness to systems. So for instance, is the artery system and the lung and a lot of biological systems have this property that they are self-similar. So if you look at one scale, you see all the arboring, and a larger scale, you see the same arboring over a certain number of steps. And that reproductive structure leads to these fractal properties. And they have the property that if you disturb part of the network, it doesn't disturb the overall function as much. Still, because you have sort of imagine that you disturb something, then on every scale, it means every distance, let's say you have to transport blood, you still have some paths going. So it's not like you are destroying everything from that scale down. So you still have stuff at the lower scale. That's sort of an idea why that's important. So for homeostasis, that's the most robust part of that kind of theory now in neural control. There was also some work on making robots do fractal stuff and so on. It's kind of died out. It was maybe it's not so clear it's so useful, and do it also with regular noise. I don't know. Maybe someone's still doing work on that. Any other questions?